which tends to profit enormously from military spending whether or not there's a war. The US economy as a whole has been badly hurt. From the 99% to the 1%. Even Donald Trump wants out of Afghanistan. This kind of madness doesn't benefit the conquering nation. I recently read an article about Iraq choosing to buy crops from nations other than the United States that quoted US farmers who were absolutely furious that Iraq would choose not to buy their products after the United States had gone to so much trouble bombing and occupying Iraq. Michael Frumkin recently wrote, quote, "The population of Iraq is about 32 million. So that means the war cost us about $25,000 per Iraqi. I think my suggestion back in 2003 that instead of staying in Iraq, we just give every Iraqi $3,000 per year for the next year or two is looking awfully good in retrospect." End quote. Of course, that model could be enlarged. Far more Afghan children starve and freeze to death than any soldier's massacre, and it would cost a lot less to feed and clothe them than it does to massacre them. And doing so would create a lot more peace and stability. $1 trillion army cannot win an occupation. There is no such thing as winning. That's what Iraq ought to have shown them. There will be no nuclear weapons moved into Afghanistan and no US-controlled pipelines. Apart from the weapons makers and mercenary profiteers, nobody gains. We in the United States didn't just lose money in Iraq. We lost our civil liberties at home, our representative government, our vestigial restrictions on presidential war powers. Obama went into Libya without even bothering to lie to Congress, and Leon Panetta this week told Senator Sessions that Obama can go into Syria without Congress or the United Nations. We lost our prohibitions on torture, murder, and lawless imprisonment. We lost religious tolerance. We lost the idea that there is anything presidents can do other than sex that can get them impeached. We created temporary despots. The authorizations to use military force from 2001 and the Iraq one from 2003 are still on the books. Obama and another president or Congress could send drones or troops into Iraq. The Iraq authorization to use military force is broader than the Afghanistan one. Bush and Obama have used it to justify worldwide war on people they label terrorists who do not have any plausible connection to September 11th, and to wiretap the rest of us. And the Congress voted down ending that authorization just because they're ending the war it authorized. We also lost in Iraq all credibility as supporters of the rule of law. Those who had seen immunity effectively given to the killers of Haditha knew what to expect when the Afghan government demanded an open trial in Afghanistan for the killer of Kandahar. We lost all sense of gratitude and requirement of protection for whistleblowers as Obama has expanded on Bush's approach of treating them as traitors. We lost the goodwill of much of the world. We became hated, loathed, despised, detested. Some of those in power in the United States recovered a reluctance to launch huge wars and lose lots of US military lives, but they found an alternative in bombs and drones. And if relatively few drone pilots lose their minds or kill themselves, that doesn't mean there won't be blowback, or that there is not a direct cost to our culture becoming an empire that uses robots to kill. The damage to US veterans, their families, and those around them will go on for decades. The brain damage, PTSD, and suicide epidemics just begin to tell the story of human and financial cost. The divorce, child neglect, and child abuse will be long-lasting, not to mention the desire of many of those children to please their parents by going to wars themselves. Unbeknownst to the US media, of course, the bulk of the cost of a war is borne by the nation where the war is fought. On the question of what has been done to Iraq, I highly recommend Michael Oderman's book, Erasing Iraq. Last year, we watched the people of Egypt overthrow a US-backed dictator in 3 weeks at a cost of 300 deaths. They only overthrew the one individual, not the corrupt military government. They have a long ways to go, but compare Iraq. Over 20 years, the United States has replaced a dictator with a corrupt military government at a cost of millions of lives, trillions of dollars spent, trillions of dollars in infrastructure destroyed, a regional refugee crisis, ethnic and religious strife, segregated towns and neighborhoods, empowered religious fanatics. We've set back women's rights, effectively eliminated gay and lesbian rights, nearly killed off some minority groups, decimated the nation's cultural heritage, and created a generation of people without the experience of peace, without education, without proper nutrition, without tolerance, without health care, without a functioning government, and without affection or even indifference to our country. What a bargain. Surely nonviolence could never have done so much. Or as Obama put it when accepting his Nobel Peace Prize just after rejecting the model of Martin Luther King Jr., quote, "Negotiations cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force is sometimes necessary is not a call to cynicism, it is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man and the limits of reason," end quote. Well, imperfections of someone. In place of reason, the war on Iraq gave us this, as recounted by U.S. soldier Ethan McCord, quote, "We had a pretty gung-ho commander who decided that because we were getting hit by IEDs a lot, there would be a new battalion SOP, standard operating procedure. He goes, quote, if someone in your line gets hit with an IED, 360 rotational fire, you kill every motherfucker on the street," end quote. Another way to kill every motherfucker on the street is to destroy water supplies, sewage plants, hospitals, and bridges. This we have done most extensively in 1991 and 2003. On the first occasion, a U.S. Air Force planning officer justified these criminal acts as no worse and having no other purpose than economic sanctions. Quote, "People say you didn't recognize that it was going to have an effect on water or sewage. Well, what were we trying to do with sanctions? Help out the Iraqi people? No. What we were doing with the attacks on infrastructure was to accelerate the effects of the sanctions," end quote. Sanctions on Iran are for the same purpose. Either they will provoke Iran just as they did Japan these many years ago, or they will create a logic that explains war on the grounds that the sanctions haven't succeeded in overthrowing a sovereign government that we haven't overthrown since 1953. The Madeleine Albrights of the world who thought that killing 500,000 Iraqi children was a price worth paying for some strategic purpose need to be asked now that the strategic purpose has presumably been achieved or been abandoned. Why in the hell are we not making reparations to the Iraqi people? We have not built them a nation. We haven't built anyone a nation unless you count Germany and Japan, which we first burned to the ground and have since never left. Supposedly we built a nation in Grenada and another over a mere 23 years in Panama, although I'm not convinced that both wouldn't have been better off left alone. Nobody claims we built a nation in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, or Iraq. Well, maybe some do, but they don't live there. Half the world's refugees are from Afghanistan and Iraq. Possibly half the world's torture victims are from Afghanistan and Iraq. We owe reparations. Instead, with the crime ending in Iraq, its architects are on book tours instead of trial. Their successor in the White House has embraced the lies. The lie that invading Iraq was about so-called weapons of mass destruction, and the lie that escalating the war on Iraq helped to win it. These lies are carried over as lessons for Afghanistan and elsewhere. It is critical that we continue to counter them. U.S. polling on belief that the Iraq war was based on lies paralleled and led polling on opposition to that war. But memories are short. We have a great deal to be gained from continually reminding our country of the lies. George Galloway, the great former British member of Parliament, recently wrote, quote, "I told Tony Blair, outside the men's lavatory in the library corridor of the House of Commons, to be precise, that the fall of Baghdad would not be the beginning of the end, but merely the end of the beginning, and that the Iraqis would fight them with their teeth if necessary until they had driven them from their land. I told Blair that there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq, but that if he and Bush were to invade, there would be thousands of them. But two things, as George W. Bush would put it, I misunderestimated. First, that when the tower of lies on which the case for the Iraq war had been constructed was exposed, the credibility of the political systems of the two main liars would collapse under the weight. And second, that the example of the Iraqi resistance would trigger seismic changes in the Arabian landscape from Marrakesh to Bahrain. Almost nobody in Britain or America any longer believes a word their politicians say. This profound change is not wholly the result of the Iraq war, but it moved into top gear following the war and the militarized mendacity that paved the way to it. In America, this malaise has fueled both the Tea Party phenomenon and the Occupy movement alike, even if the word Iraq seldom crosses their lips. And from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf, the plates are moving still." End quote. Yes, but here in the land of the free, people have a tendency to believe their government lies about everything except war. That it lies about war too, we need constantly to remind each other. In that spirit, I will close with this, and I have drafted what I take to be the top 10 lying, scheming reasons to treat Iran the way we treated Iraq. 1, Iran has threatened to fight back if attacked, and that's a war crime, and war crimes must be punished. 2, my television says Iran has nukes. I'm sure it's true this time, just like with North Korea. I'm sure they're next. We only bomb places that really truly have nukes and are in the axis of evil, except Iraq, which was different. 3, Iraq didn't go so badly. Considering how lousy its government is, the place is better off with so many people having left or died. Really, that one couldn't have worked out better if we'd planned it. 4, when we threaten to cut off Iran's oil, Iran threatens to cut off Iran's oil, which is absolutely intolerable. What would we do without that oil? And what good is buying it if they want to sell it? 5, Iran was secretly behind 9/11. I read it online. And if it wasn't, that's worse. Iran hasn't attacked another nation in centuries, which means its next attack is going to come very soon. 6, Iranians are religious nuts, unlike Israelis and Americans. Most Israelis don't want to attack Iran, but the holy Israeli government does, and to oppose that decision would be to sin against God. 7, Iranians are so stupid that when we murder their scientists, they try to hire a car dealer in Texas to hire a drug gang in Mexico to murder a Saudi ambassador in Washington, and then they don't do it just to make us look bad for catching them. 7, Part B. Oh, and stupid people should be bombed. They're not civilized. 8, war is good for the U.S. economy and the Iranian economy too. Troops stationed in Iran would buy stuff. And women who survived the war would have more rights, like in Virginia. We owe Iranians this after that little mishap in 1953. 9, this is the only way to unite the region. Either we bomb Iran and it swears its eternal love to us, or if necessary, we occupy Iran to liberate it like its neighbors, which shouldn't take that long. Look how well Afghanistan is going already. Number 10, they won't give our drone back.
Wow. So that was David Swanson. And I wanted to mention Michael Otterman. Michael Otterman is going to speak next, and I left out one of his very important books, A Mare I Can Torture. A Mare I Can Torture. Relevant to David's point about half of the torture victims being from Iran and Afghanistan. So Michael will be next. Thanks.
Thanks, and I wish I could follow up that top 10 list with something as clever and funny. But the reality is, with my first book, American Torture, there was a, the way it's spelled on the cover, Amer I Can Torture, which speaks to the psychology of torture as well. And my latest book, Erasing Iraq, I tried in both cases to, not speak myself. I'm an American, a journalist. I wanted to just focus on the voices of, in this case, victims of Guantanamo, other places of American torture, stretching back to Vietnam and earlier. And with this one, the same voices of Iraqis, not just since 2003, but going back to the sanctions and the first Gulf War, which David spelled out very clearly just how devastating, especially to the infrastructure, that war was, which even in forums, on this one, I'm so appreciative he brought that up, because even in forums like this, sometimes we don't even examine the damage from the first Gulf War and the sanctions period. The first Gulf War, as David said, knocked out most of the power stations, sewage plants, and this is in a country that did have the best healthcare in the region, the most developed infrastructure in the region. Suddenly, it was to quote a U.S. general, bombed into the Stone Age, and that's where the trauma begins. In terms of where I pick up in this book. Of course, there was the Iran-Iraq War before it, which was horrible in a lot of different ways. But basically, what I sought to do in this book is to gather these voices, because we could have a discussion about media silence. But I think one of the most effective ways to get people to care, to turn on, is to, not maybe even hear what I have to say, although, I'm talking now, but to hear the voices of actual victims, the Iraqis in this case. And so that's what I set out to do here in the book. I went to Syria and Jordan, spent time with Iraqi refugees. I looked at blogs. The 2003 invasion is unique in the sense it was the first invasion or U.S. invasion that was essentially live. They didn't have Twitter then; it would have been live tweeted, but it was at least live blogged. And so you have blog posts coming out of Baghdad describing what's going on in ways obviously CNN and other big media couldn't or didn't want to cover. So I brought those narratives in, and those things are still online, obviously, just sitting out there, into this portrait of destruction. So after all my research and travel and blah blah blah, what did I kind of conclude? Well, I came across a word, I didn't invent it, that was used in the context of Bosnia, called sociocide. Sociocide it's like genocide, but a little bit different. A sociocide is the destruction of a society. And I thought, after going through these narratives, looking at all the destruction, it was the only kind of apt word to describe what the United States has been doing, and you could argue continues to do in certain respects in Iraq. It wasn't a successful sociocide. Obviously, Iraq lives on. There's civil society, although has its problems, it remains strong, and the country is starting to rebuild. So it wasn't a complete sociocide, but I call it in the book, at least an attempted sociocide. And because what does that term involve? Okay, well, you have the deaths. First Gulf War, 20,000 outright. Sanctions, over 500,000 children died. That's mostly due to lack of medicines, the issues with power and how it affected hospitals, malnutrition, things like that. And then you have the 2003 invasion. Estimates. The Lancet estimate of it would be extrapolated today well over 1 million deaths. But even if you go with the bare minimum Iraqi body count figure, which this is the organization that just goes through media accounts and just tallies every time the media mentions someone has died in Iraq. They're at like 110,000, but with the WikiLeaks documents, they're adding at least 50,000 more, so maybe 160,000 verifiable, media accounted deaths. So you have the deaths, you have the displacement, which I could talk about a little bit later, within Iraq, up to 2 million internally displaced. You have currently today about 500,000 Iraqis living in slums and makeshift, conditions, buildings and bombed out sites. And then you have, obviously, outside of Iraq, the refugees, which that crisis really got going in probably around, in a serious, very serious way, 2005, 2006, during the start of the Civil War. Over 1 million Iraqis in Syria, which now you have the unique situation of many Iraqis in Syria. They went there to escape the violence in Iraq, being forced back into Iraq due to the uprising there. But you have all this displacement. You have the refugee crisis. You have the deaths. But what about the destruction of, say, the Baghdad Museum? Mm-hmm. Where does that fit in? In this case, you have something essentially like the Met. You could imagine it. Uptown, the Met. Before the invasion, you had NGOs in the U.S., in Iraq, around the world. When it looked like Bush was going to do this thing, pleading, op-eds were written, reports were sent. The State Department itself even identified, Baghdad Museum and other cultural heritage sites as places that should be protected. U.S. troops were stationed, 3 or 4 blocks away. And when Baghdad fell, and in that vacuum of just criminality and riots and looting, the Baghdad Museum was not protected, completely overrun by looters, by people, just wanted to make a buck, just people running amok, and over 9,000 artifacts remain missing or lost. Some of these priceless artifacts were recovered. Many haven't, and so where do you put that in like an accounting of the in the aggression and abuse and everything else that we've inflicted? Something that's not talked about is archaeology as well. It's related to this question of art. Iraq has if not one of the most rich sources, of archaeological artifacts. And actually under Saddam Hussein, I'm not glorifying this in any way, but one of the things he did was actually had pretty strong control over the extraction and permits around archaeology. Obviously, since he was deposed, there's been, amid all the chaos, you have looters coming in and just ripping things out of the ground. And the problem with that is, unless a dig is properly recorded, and that precise location, angle, position, distance from the surface is recorded by the archaeologists of the item that's removed, that's not done. The piece is worthless, essentially. I mean, maybe you get a few $100s on the black market, but something that is priceless and could have told us about our shared history or the civilization living there at the time in that particular location, that's completely lost. And so this actually continues, rampant looting of archaeological sites and sales of these products on the black market. Another level of trauma. Okay, you have within Iraq itself, and still today, the New York Times, to its credit, had an article last week about the murder of gays and lesbians in Iraq, which continues. And the Times and other papers call it. People have targeted emo kids. Emo kids in Iraq maybe is a little different than here. Kids that just don't fit the mold of your typical, straight-laced teenager. They look a bit goth. They have long hair. They've been targeted hugely by the remnants of militias and religious groups, and they have no protection whatsoever. And so hundreds have been killed and continue to be killed. And then one of the things I kind of stumbled into in my research is the death of religious groups themselves. I spent some time with the Mandaeans. Mandaeanism is a religion. It's a very pacifist religion. It's very almost Quaker-like, very pacifist. They've lived in Iraq for millennia, thousands of years, without a situation like they find themselves in today, where there was about 50,000 or so Mandaeans in Iraq before the invasion. Today, the most recent estimates are about 5,000 Mandaeans are left. Many have been killed. Most have left as refugees. Like I said, they're pacifist, and so even to the extent that they don't raise arms in self-defense unless it's right in their face. But you have now pockets of Mandaean communities scattered around the world, including the United States, but big pockets in Australia and Germany and elsewhere. The problem is, for this group in particular, you can't convert into Mandaeanism. You have to be born a Mandaean, and if you marry outside the faith, you're no longer Mandaean. And so, while in Iraq the integrity of the community allowed it to prosper and self-perpetuate, now that the community has been just shattered and spread across the world, this is actually a whole religion and a religious group, which is, you could say, dying out to that extent. And so, why am I going through all this? So, just to say that sociocide, it's the only word that I found kind of encapsulates all of these levels of trauma, and then that's really kind of the legacy that we leave behind in Iraq. And so maybe I'll just end my remarks with, again, Iraqis themselves. I mentioned earlier about the blogosphere. The Iraqi blogosphere remained strong, but it was unique in the fact that you had Iraqis blogging in English, because Iraqis are very educated people by and large, and so you have Iraqis blogging in English as the bombs were dropping. One of the most I don't know, famous, and I think most famous and just powerful voices among the bloggers is this woman named Riverbend, who she hasn't actually blogged. She became a refugee herself in 2007, and that's when she ended her blog. But she was one of the real voices of conscience and coming from Iraq, which at the time, we talk about how bad the media coverage was and remains. That's true. But you also had these, if you knew where to look, which wasn't that hard if you just Googled Iraqi blogs, you have these really powerful, moving narratives coming out of the country. And so I'll just end with maybe one posting of hers. She writes, "A 12-year-old boy was shot in his garden while playing. The Americans say he was caught in the crossfire between them and someone else. His mother was almost tearing her hair out, and his father was beating the ground and moaning. He looked ready to kill. People talk about the future, and how 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, things are going to be better. Some people no longer have a future. The parents of that boy no longer care about the future of Iraq or the future of America or anything else. They buried their future last night. I'm sure the future means as much to them as it does to the parents of the soldiers dying in Iraq on a daily basis. When Bush, quote, brought the war to the terrorists, he failed to mention he wouldn't be fighting it in some distant mountains or barren deserts. The front line is our homes. The collateral damage are our friends and families." And so, Riverbend.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. There you go.
Can I just introduce you?
Yes, you can.
I was going to bring up the emo killings as well.
Yeah.
That was, there's the irony of one society occupying another. The hate crimes from the U.S. come into this society. It's just in a new form. I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Larry Everest, who I believe was in Iraq right during and after the first Gulf War, right?
After 1991.
In the aftermath of it, and I remember you did one of the first mass videos that was going around the anti-war movement 21 years ago. Larry has a book, Oil, Power, and Empire, Iraq and the U.S. Global Agenda, and he's going to be our third panelist, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you. On October 21st, when Obama announced the last troops would leave Iraq in December, here's what he said. Quote, "The last American soldiers will cross the border out of Iraq with their heads held high, proud of their success and knowing that the American people stand united in our support for our troops. This December will be a time to reflect on all that we've been through in this war. I'll join the American people in paying tribute to the more than 1 million Americans who've served in Iraq. We'll honor our many wounded warriors and the nearly 4,500 American patriots and their Iraqi coalition partners who gave their lives to this effort." Just stop and, I could spend an hour just dissecting that, but just stop and think for 1 minute about that. Our heads held high, as if this was some kind of a triumph. Support the troops. What, the troops at Haditha, who murdered 24 women and children and others because someone was killed by a roadside bomb, and then it was covered up, or all the other atrocities we could mention. And then I like this. It's time to reflect on all we have been through. Not Riverbend, not the people you talked to in Syria. No, not them. And let's honor the 4,500. Oh, and those other Iraqis, it's the throwaway line, who sacrificed their lives. In other words, American lives are all that count here. American chauvinism and support for the American military that's carrying out illegal, unjust, immoral wars and committing war crimes. So anyway, with that, I am glad to be talking about Iraq. You know, we can't erase the memory of Iraq, of what happened there, the lessons we should be learning. And I like David's point. No, repeat the lies that we're told. Let people know. And that's what I thought about. It's just my book actually deals with a history of U.S. and British intervention in Iraq since the 1920s. It goes through the Iran-Iraq War, the sanctions. It's interesting because now there's a big thing about the IAEA in Iran, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if you read my book, you'll find out the IAEA was involved in planning coup d'etats and assassination attempts against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Of course, that's not mentioned. But anyway, so I think it's very important to ponder the real lessons of Iraq, and that's what I want to do today. And not feel, oh, well, and, you know, this is reflected in our attendance here. Oh, that's over with. You know, let's move on. Or let's move nowhere. You know, that we really, the Iraq War is incredibly revealing of the nature of this system, the illegitimacy of the entire system, and the need for fundamental change and revolution. If you stop and think about this. And that's what I want to reflect on a little bit here today. So first of all, what I want to start out with is a quote, which I think I want to deconstruct this. This is from Basics, from the talks and writings of Bob Avakian, who's the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party that I support. I write for its newspaper, Revolution. He writes, the essence of what exists in the U.S. is not democracy, but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures to enforce that capitalism, imperialism.
Absolutely.
What the U.S. spreads around the world is not democracy, but imperialism and political structures to enforce that imperialism. So just think about that. Not democracy, but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures that support it. We didn't vote for the Iraq War, if you remember, and when the Iraq War began, 15 million people around the world, and I mean hundreds of thousands in this country, went out for the biggest protest, you know, and I think even as big as some of them in the 60s. Oh, that's a focus group, never mind. In other words, the political structures were not in any way reflective of what people needed or want. They reflected the needs of capitalism, imperialism. That's what they were doing. Did the war reflect the consent of the governed? Oh, here's what we're going to do in Iraq. Would you like us to do that? No, as David pointed out, one lie after another. You know, sometimes, and I liked your 10 lies because it is hard to get how contorted and conflated and twisted all of this. No, Saddam Hussein's a Sunni and he's a secular ruler, but no, he's in bed with Al-Qaeda, the Islamic fundamentalists, who, by the way, hate him. I mean, you know, never mind, it's all, we heard it on Fox News. You know, what about the so-called free press? That's supposed to be a pillar of democracy. It wasn't just that they repeated lies. They suppressed anyone who spoke the truth. Phil Donahue, gone. You know, Jeff Cohen, who's at this at the Left Forum here, I saw presenting. I think he's with you tomorrow or something. Yeah,
again, tomorrow, 10
tomorrow,
a.m. in
yeah.
the big auditorium.
He writes a book about how on the Phil Donahue show, if they had one leftist, they had to have 10 right-wingers to balance it out. You know, in other words, there's a dictatorship in the media that serves capitalism, imperialism, and then what does that say about the nature of that system? It's a system. In other words, this quote I read, what the essence of what exists, points to the fact that the economic base of society, the capitalist system, is what sets the terms, not public opinion, not the interests of people, not how you vote, none of that. The system is determined and the terms are set by the needs of this capitalist imperialist system, and the political structures serve that. And what are the needs of that system? This is a system that demands global exploitation of labor. Go see the Mike Daisey, Agony and Ecstasy of Steve Jobs, Apple, all their parts made in China and so on and so forth. And it demands control of resources, it demands control of markets, and all of this is enforced how? By military bases in 732 military bases in what, 120 or 130 countries, and one war or intervention after another by violence. And this is how the system actually functions. This is how it works, and this is actually what was behind the Iraq War, because a lot of people realize that lies were told in the Iraq War, but they don't realize why the war was fought. You know, this is the biggest lie of all. The New York Times sometimes will say, well, it's true that Judith Miller made a mistake in her reporting. We'll leave aside the fact that all this was deliberate. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad intelligence. But what they never tell you is, oh, by the way, this was a war of imperialism, because since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we, the U.S. ruling class, realized that we have an opportunity to create an unchallenged empire across the globe because we don't face any other superpowers. And if we don't seize this opportunity, our window of the unipolar moment, as they called it, could vanish and would be in big trouble, because we have a lot of problems and contradictions in our own system, and we're facing China and Russia. They could reemerge. In fact, let's not even let any regional powers rise to challenge us. And this was the driving logic behind the whole war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. A lot of people thought, oh, the invasion of Iraq was a diversion from the quote-unquote real war on terror. No, it wasn't. It was the perfect embodiment of the quote-unquote real war on terror, which was never about simply catching a few dozen or a few hundred or however many there were, Al-Qaeda or Saudi or, whatever, group did the 9/11 attacks. It was about restructuring the entire Middle East and Central Asia and locking it more firmly under U.S. domination, and yes, defeating Islamic fundamentalism because it was creating problems for the U.S. This is a big reason they don't like Iran. And then using that region really as a hammer against the rest of the world. Why is the Middle East so important to the functioning of the system? And here, I do think the capitalist class overall benefits from this. That's what keeps the wheels humming and turning. Yes, they're contractors that make some money, sure, but that's not the essence of it, because one U.S. president after another, Democrat or Republican, it doesn't matter, has considered the control of the Middle East central to U.S. global power, right? This is why Israel looms so large for the U.S., because it's their military outpost. The Middle East, 60% of the world's energy sources. Energy is a strategic commodity that allows you to, it's not about SUVs and, do consumers have good gas prices. It's about global dominance, because if you control oil, you can shape the global economy and you can control powers that depend on oil. And again, I document all of this in the book, quotes from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And then the Middle East, I brought my map and forgot to bring it here. It's the crossroads between Africa, Asia, Europe. Every world war what gets invaded, the Middle East. So this is what the war on Iraq was about. Iraq was a problem. Overthrow Hussein. Try to reshape this whole region. And then what did the U.S. export to Iraq? Not democracy, but political structures that support capitalism, imperialism. They had their handful of crony puppets and bootlickers that they wanted to put in power. That didn't work out for them. So what did they do? They empowered reactionary Shia religious parties, religious fundamentalists, and capitalists and oppressors is what they did. That's what they brought to Iraq. And Mike and David have both talked about the horrors that this has meant for the Iraqi people. I don't care how many Iraqis hold up their purple fingers because they voted. This was a vote taken after the U.S. conquered Iraq, and it was under military occupation, and it was shaped to a large degree, not simply because the U.S. hasn't had full control of this, by the U.S. military. So, and I just think it's important to think about these things, because if people understood the essence of what exists in the United States is not democracy, but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures that support capitalism, imperialism, they would think completely differently about why things happen, what to do about any of this, the elections, voting, all this nonsense we see on television, campaigning 24 hours a day, and just basically it's which imperialist is going to audition for the other imperialists about who's going to be chosen to lead the imperialist empire. People wouldn't be so baffled about Obama. Gosh, I thought he was such a good man. Why is he doing it? He is part of a political structure that serves capitalism, imperialism. Obama the peacemaker, now getting ready to attack war. So these are things I think that are just incredibly important to think about. Secondly, the illegitimacy. Here's the shame of this thing. First of all, you read a lot. What did we learn from this? As if all of us are the same as the 1% or the ruling class that actually run the system. Well, they learned to do this in a more clever way. In other words, Obama is being, in a certain way, more cautious about Iran because he knows he has to build up the diplomatic and the public opinion in a more careful way than Bush did against Iraq. The U.S. paid dearly for the fact that he wasn't able to get UN sanction for this, that it was obviously a war crime, an illegal war, and because, so many people saw it as utterly illegitimate, So this is one thing they've learned. They haven't learned not to fight wars. They haven't learned, gee, imperialism's no good. It really hurts a lot of people. No. This is the shame of it. You were, what you were saying, David, made me think about this. You said, war doesn't do anyone any good, and it's true. It's brought one horror after another to the Iraqi people, but the U.S. imperialists are still at it. They are still trying to fight their way through all this chaos and suffering they've created in the Middle East in order to come out of it with renewed control. Look at what they're doing in Syria. Here, Bahrain, it's great if Bahrain represses all the people. That's not a problem. But the U.S. is talking about military intervention in Syria now. So what? How am I?
Maybe 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, all right.
Got a question?
So, it'll be 4 minutes. So the point is, and now you know, how is the U.S. making up for a strategic defeat in Iraq? This is one of the reasons that they're escalating the threats on Iran, which are very serious and very real. I'm going to be doing a panel tomorrow at 10 in the morning in the large lecture hall north with Michael Clare and Layla Zand on this. But look, the concluding part of what I really want to get to is that if this system is responsible for all this, and I am arguing that it is, we need a whole different system. I mean, if we're serious about stopping this, I don't want to be protesting war for the rest of my life and my children's and their children and all that. We need to end this. I think this is possible through revolution and socialism and communism. And I think it's possible because there's a new vision of revolution and communism that's been brought forward by Bob Avakian that I really urge people to engage with and find out about. He's looked at the experience of revolutions in the past, the great achievements, but also the serious shortcomings, and incorporated a lot of the knowledge that's come forward since the last revolutions happened under Lenin and Mao, and brought forward this very vibrant new synthesis of communism. And I want to read I want people to stop and imagine what the world would be like if we did live in a socialist republic based on this new synthesis. Because I'm going to read from this new Constitution, which is a blueprint for such a republic, very different than what we live now. And I want to just read a passage on what this socialist state would do the day after the revolution in terms of foreign policy. Here's what it says. We will dismantle all remaining bases of the former imperialist USA and other countries. The new socialist republic renounces all wars of aggression and domination and all occupation of other countries. It will not develop and will not use nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. It will wage a determined and many-sided struggle to rid the world of all such weapons, and it will do this as part of the larger overall struggle to defeat and dismantle all imperialist and reactionary states and forces and to advance toward the achievement of communism throughout the world, which will finally make it possible for the desires and dreams of countless human beings throughout history and the fundamental interests of humanity for a world without war to at long last be realized. I believe that's a future worth fighting for. Thank you. No, you can't have the mic back. What are you talking about?
For those folks that came in a little bit late, this panel is asking the question, what war? And it's been looking, I think, quite deeply into the effects of the 9-year U.S. occupation of Iraq. And this is a reminder that Monday and Tuesday, the 19th and 20th, actually, depending on what time zone you were in, is the 9 years since shock and awe started. Some of us were much younger when that war started. And in a sense, the fact that we're living in an empire which now has an even longer war going on, Afghanistan. If we could have done panels on all we wanted to do, I think we would have added one on Afghanistan, especially with what happened over the last week, which has shined a new and sharper light on the nature of these occupations. People have referred to the U.S. saying, well, it was one guy that did this. There's a lot of eyewitnesses that are saying that, in fact, it wasn't one sergeant who was battle-weary that did this. I don't know exactly what happened, but I do know that these occupations have set up that very situation to happen repeatedly. People spoke about the Haditha massacre in Iraq. There's the collateral murder where 13 civilians were killed. This is just a repeated story. This is exactly what these occupations are about. So there's the opportunity for the panelists to talk to each other and for us all to engage in this. But, you know, I'd like to put out the question, speaking for War Criminals Watch, which, by the way, David is on our board for War Criminals Watch. And for those of you who don't know, we rather doggedly across the country follow, protest, expose, write about, holler at, confront the Bush regime war criminals. And there's a lot of evidence and pressure on us to expand that list to include the people in the Obama administration who have continued these war crimes. But that's one of the things that World Can't Wait does. We have in front of PACE today a model drone that's a Reaper 9. It's 1/5 the scale of a drone that is increasingly flying over all these countries. As David mentioned, there's no country that Barack Obama at this point has declined, as far as we know, to send drones over or to use targeted killings. We may not know it, but there's none that we are told that it hasn't happened in. This is the situation we're confronting, and I do feel relatively small as our numbers are, and I appreciate the 3 cameras being here, because we are going to get this story out. We are not going to give up. That it's really incumbent on people in this room not only to grapple with the reality of what's been done in our name, but I want everyone to leave with one of our new buttons, No War on Iran, and come to one of the panels tomorrow. David has an anti-war panel with Medea Benjamin at 10 a.m. Larry and I are on one about Iran specifically. None of that is enough. Several of us all of us actually, will be at the United National Anti-War Conference next weekend in Stamford, Connecticut, and speaking for all of us, I'm sure that we are dedicating our lives in large part to stopping, what's being done in our name, although we may have different ways of going about it. But I'd really like to open up the question of, David mentioned, or I think it was Larry mentioned, that the U.S. was strategically defeated in Iraq, and that maybe going after Iran is a response to that. To me, that's fairly intriguing. It's been announced that this was a good war and it was won, even by the president who said it was a stupid war and he was going to end it. But we have a question right up here, and we'll keep this pretty informal. You can direct a question to any of the panelists or make a comment.
Well, I work with a group in San Francisco. It's called the War and Law Week, and we've been very, very worried about the Iran war since 2005. And Cheney was trying to start a war against Iran. And I mean, I personally feel that there's something about Iran having a central bank that is independent of the World Trade Organization, which is what they're going after and what they went after in Libya with Gaddafi. But whatever they're going after, even this archaic oil that's tanking us into global warming, whatever it is that they're after, they are dead serious about it. And the fact is, the only stuff that we're getting on TV is how Iran is making a weapon, which is a lie, and how we have to stop it, which is bullshit, because the it is a ghost. So I'm asking generally if there's some way that we could use international organizations, although they show very little hope, even the UN, although that shows less than no hope. But if there are ambassadors and stuff who could get something started to look at what the IAEA is supposed to be doing, what's happening with Fukushima, Indian Point, and all these other things that are going to go off like firecrackers if we have, solar flares. They're supposed to keep us safe, and instead going into construing this crap in Iran, and also how we can get the public on board that there is another way, and that is not to just starve Iran. Because these sanctions are causing planes to go down. It's causing, it's causing mayhem. It's crazy, and for what? Why aren't we sanctioning Israel? Why aren't we sanctioning the United States? Instead, we're sanctioning Iran. Iran actually sent physicians to Louisiana where people don't trust doctors. They sent physicians free of charge to help people in a clinic where there's black child mortality in Mississippi. And that even came through the LA Times. This was years ago. And this is, you know, Iran is doing outreach. I'm not going to say it's all good. They're really weird to women and stuff. They stone them and stuff. But, you know, nobody is all good. But Iran is not threatening other countries. And if the United States allows Israel to blow up nuclear reactors in Iran, we might as well kiss our planet goodbye. So I'm just wondering, is there some sane voice of reason, some authority that we can appeal to? Because Obama is hogtied and talking out of, you know, every orifice he can find.
Good question. The sane authority to appeal to. I know you guys are going to have something to say about this, and then let me know if there are other places you want to go with questions. Okay.
Hold the microphone so close.
I'm sorry.
Well, needless to say, we are ourselves the sane authority to appeal to, and one place where we're collecting information and counter propaganda is don'tattackiran.org, where we're also organizing campaigns to influence and mobilize and resist, and where, by the way, not this website, but this movement to not Iraq Iran has been succeeding for years now. I mean, there was a serious possibility in 06, 07 of a war on Iran. They would have gone into Iran in 2004 if Iraq had gone the way they hoped it went, right? They're not going into Iran because Iraq didn't go well for the Pentagon. I mean, Iran's been on the list, and it's taken this long because of what happened in Iraq and because of the resistance to the very similar lies. And so I think it's wonderful what War Criminals Watch is doing. I think we have to keep reminding everybody. But I think what we need right now is maybe a video that goes viral called something like Make Obama Famous. Because we have our war criminals, and apparently young people will at least watch a video about a war criminal and get their parents to give hundreds of thousands of dollars to arresting him, at least if he's African and nowhere to be found in the country he's supposedly in and so forth. Well, if we can somehow get that kind of energy into treating these wars as the crimes they are, rather than talking about going into Iran because of the success that Iraq was, which is what you will hear now, we might get somewhere. I just wanted to reply really briefly to what Larry said, in that there are those who benefit from, at least in the short term, at least in their minds, from the threat of war, from how the threat of war allows the exploitation of other countries. But the wars themselves seem to benefit very few people. And whether we're actually better off, any of us, from that exploitation is a serious question. That people do keep doing something doesn't prove it benefits them. Alcoholics keep drinking. It doesn't prove that they are being benefited from that. I think, and the other point was that the statement that you closed with, Larry, renouncing wars of aggression and domination, I think is almost there. But in 1928, the rich nations of the world signed a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate 85-1 that renounced all war, that very intentionally renounced all war. There was an endless debate and negotiation, and they refused to renounce just wars of aggression. That the idea was, we put dueling behind us as a way to settle individual disputes and not just aggressive dueling. We didn't keep defensive dueling, right? If we're going to outgrow war, or if we're going to renounce war as an institution, as we did slavery, we are not going to renounce wars of aggression. We're going to renounce war. So it's a friendly amendment.
Well, that's good. Did you want to? I have a couple of things to say.
Okay, I'll just. I can't agree with you more. The authority is in this room, and with social media, as we saw with the somewhat odd Kony video, there is this kind of, it's there, and maybe it's misdirected in certain ways with this Kony thing, for a number of odd reasons. But the power of that video, and there's a lot of things that have gone viral with a kind of a positive or social conscious message. maybe this movement, around Iran right now, we haven't hit that that spark where you have kids in high school, which is really the power of the Kony thing. Was you had mainstream people like Oprah, and rappers like tweeting about it, and that's what really got the ball rolling. But I don't think we're that far away from having something resonate, using these social technologies. But I'd put my faith in, the people in this room, but using those types of tools because they've worked elsewhere.
Well, I feel like I have to open this for the mic to work, but that isn't true. I don't. In terms of tools, we do have this petition, which is on warisacrime.org, and really, we want to do a big voice acclamation here tomorrow at the plenary. Please take copies of this, email them, sign it, circulate them. It's a beginning. In terms of one thing, the war. There are too many people that think that Obama's trying to prevent war with Iran. The meetings with Netanyahu, I'm not going to go on about this, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, actually accelerated the danger of war. And the Union of Concerned Scientists estimated one bunker buster bomb on the Natanz facility could lead to 100,000 deaths and massive radiation clouds. So we're really, this is a really serious thing. And we are the authority because, again, the political structures in this country serve capitalism, imperialism. It's a system. No matter who's in power, no matter which party you're talking about, they're serving that system. I wanted to just two quick things. My point on Iraq is that the U.S. really had these very grand ambitions for what they were going to do with Iraq. There at the creation, the flat tech. I mean, they had a whole a neocon fantasy for what the neoliberal dream of what they wanted to do with Iraq, turn it into a platform for both military operations and to economically and politically transform the whole region, strengthen Israel, and all of it. But their plans kept running aground, and even the adjustments to their plans ran into ground. I don't know if they printed up this article I wrote from Revolution on it. Anyway, even the decision to withdraw all U.S. military forces was forced upon the U.S. This was not how they wanted it to end. They wanted to leave 15 to 20,000 troops. So, and Iran's influence has greatly increased in Iraq. I'm not saying Iraq's a puppet, any of that. So it's that increase in Iranian influence that a lot of people say, well, they've been threatening Iran for 10 years. This is just another bluff. My argument is that the actual changes in the geopolitical terrain in the Middle East are part of what is driving this, including U.S. failure. If I said strategic defeat, that probably was overstating it. But they failed to get what they wanted out of Iraq, and it's creating problems for them. And that's one of the factors driving this war on Iran now that's not the same as it was before. And listen, I appreciate your comment on the Constitution. I feel like this is just something to really, to have a debate on this kind of a thing, because if we're not fighting for solutions, what are we doing? And just one of the things, you didn't go there, but I was sort of thinking about it. What's the difference between this and a declaration by the imperialist powers that they never end up keeping about war? Well, this is a whole new kind of state power where you overthrow capitalism, which is what's driving this drive for war. I mean, Lenin in 1917 was the only leader that just ended their participation in World War I and did the first WikiLeaks when they published the secret treaties, you know. So, but anyway, that's a. But this is a conversation worth having, is what I'm saying.
Okay, I've got a little stack starting from the back and running to you in the hat, and then you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I have quite a few things to say. Appreciate Deborah pulling everything together, and David's fury, which is energizing and human, and Larry's historical context, but especially the heart that Michael brings to this issue, and the personal stories of Iraqis. And I'm surprised there's no Iraqi on the panel. There are plenty of refugees in this country as well as in Syria, Jordan, and other places. So it would have been great to invite one.
Well, just to clarify, we invited more than one, quite a few. There's not many in New York, and none of them were available.
I would have been happy to bring some of my friends.
Okay.
One thing that wasn't mentioned is the environmental degradation, which is going on forever. And another thing that wasn't mentioned is the vast number of Iraqi refugees in this country who were forced, especially people who work for the U.S. government, as interpreters and other workers for the military, who were forced to, in some cases, to watch their homes be bombed, their families kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, their fellow interpreters being murdered, and so forth, and then wait for several years while the Immigration and Naturalization Service and State Department made them jump through absurd hoops before they could find refugee status and get free. In the case of some of my friends, it took them 4 years and the loss of family members before they were able to get out. And when they got here, they were given $800, which was to be administered by, in many cases, Lutheran Services and other so-called charitable organizations that took the money and left them at the airport and put them in Bedbug and Custom and other places in cities around the country where they weren't welcome, such as Salt Lake City, Houston, and other places. I like the idea of reparations. I think reparations will never be paid when we've murdered millions of people, and not just in the current invasion and occupation, but the previous one, and during the sanctions, which, as several of you pointed out, killed millions of Iraqis and displaced millions more. Can't really pay reparations for that, or for slavery, or genocide, or any of the other many imperialistic crimes we've committed. But I don't want to take this conversation too far away from the Iraqi people, because their suffering is ongoing. They still don't have electricity or water, or secure food supplies or jobs or homes. So I just don't want us to forget them. I'm saddened to see how few people came to this room, but I'm glad to see that those of you who are here are here. Their voices aren't being told. Their stories aren't being told in this country. It feels like a footnote to history already. And I do wish that we could reclaim the language and not call it a war in Iraq ever again. It's never been a war in Iraq. It wasn't a war. It was and is an invasion and occupation, and although our official military aren't there, the mercenaries are still there, and they'll be there forever. So thank you. I'd like to hear us speak more about the Iraq.
We are doing this same workshop next weekend at the United National Anti-War Committee, so we should talk afterwards.
I could just admit, almost. Some quick, but just very important points. There's estimates of up to at least 60,000 Iraqis and family members that worked with the U.S. In certain capacities, which we've completely turned our back on. I mean, after Vietnam, we had hundreds of thousands, Vietnamese come over. Actually, I recently found out in 2006, after Saddam was bombing Kurdistan, we actually brought over about 6,000 Iraqi Kurds to the U.S. They were processed in Guam, and they were slowly cleared from Guam, and they were moved to the United States. Sorry, 1996. I didn't mean 2006. So we've done these types of rescue operations before. We could talk about how successful they were, but at least an effort was put forth in the past. Today we have something called the SIV, Special Immigration Visa, which was the idea was put into place so to facilitate the Iraqis that worked with the U.S. and help bring them over. Something like 34 were brought over a few months ago on SIVs. 68 the month before. Since 2003, there has been about 60,000 Iraqis that one way or another through those visas and other means have come over. So 60,000, out of a refugee or displaced population of about 4 million. It's pretty pathetic. But also, you look at a country like Sweden. They've also taken in about 60,000 Iraqis, and they had nothing to do with the war. We're actually very vocal against the 2003 invasion, but they stepped up, and although their policies have gotten a bit tougher the past year or so, they've taken in as many as we have, and obviously we persecuted the war. So this is again one of these ongoing traumas of the war, and turning our backs on the Iraqis, which actually, worked with us. Again, it's one more dark chapter, which, there are groups in the U.S., List Project and others that are trying to raise awareness around this particular part of the issue with very little success. So, in 2007 or 8, there was a case of 2 Iraqis in Kentucky that were, through fingerprinting, which the government discovered much later, they were part of the resistance in Iraq, and they got through here. Ever since these 2 guys, which were, we could talk about resistance. Okay, well, your country is occupied. What are you going to do? They were part of the resistance in Iraq, and they admitted as much as well. Ever since then, this issue has become in Washington almost untouchable, because I can't think of really anyone in Congress standing up for these Iraqis, especially since this incident with these 2 Iraqis that were insurgents.
Sure.
I just wanted to say a word about the environment, which was mentioned in that wars and the military machinery and testing and training are perhaps the #1 destroyer of the natural environment. The U.S. military is our top consumer of petroleum, actually consumes a significant percentage of the petroleum that it fights the wars over. We have destroyed entire regions. Every mother who gives birth in Fallujah now asks the very same question, the first thing out of her mouth: is it normal? There are migratory birds that no longer go to Afghanistan. If they get the Strait of Hormuz mined, the Pentagon has plans to send dolphins through. I mean, if you cared about animals and birds and the natural environment and our ecosystem, the military-industrial complex would be your #1 target. When have you ever seen the Sierra Club take on a war? Take on military spending, right? If environmentalist groups took on what is their top opponent, if civil libertarian groups took on what is their top opponent, if groups that cared about children and education and every topic across the political spectrum took on what is the #1 opponent of their issues, if only in terms of where all the money is going that is needed for other things, we would get rid of this monster that Eisenhower warned us about. And you can call it a military-industrial complex, you can call it a war machine, you can call the things it does wars or occupations or killing or murder, but there is a reason to call them wars, in that war is a legal term. At least it used to be when we used to have some recognition of laws. There are laws and treaties and constitutions that deal with war. And if you accept war as something that's okay now and only occupations are bad, how do we talk about what we do to Yemen or Pakistan? Those are drone wars. We have to rid the world of wars, and we should call them occupations when they are occupations, and we should call them every bad name in the book. But if we're going to restore the rule of law, and we're going to make use of laws that are on the books, we have to call these things wars.
Thank you. I'd like to get to this gentleman here and then you. This is challenging. This mic thing.
Maybe we need a mic check.
Don't hold it too close.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm with Veterans for Peace in the Lehigh Valley, and 9 of us filed criminal complaints against Charlie Dent and Senator Specter. We did 3 at a time, went to the local FBI office and sent a copy to the U.S. Attorney in the Houston District. Obstruction of justice, dereliction of duty, seditious conspiracy. Now, you all seem concerned about similar issues. I'm wondering if any one of you have filed a criminal complaint against your member of Congress. Instead, you seem to be flying off against this capitalist and with Karl Marx. And for the life of me, I don't understand why you wouldn't adopt a real revolutionary like Thomas Paine, a homegrown, proven, pragmatic revolutionary. And we're going to give a talk about him tomorrow. And my point is, we're the Thomas Paine chapter of Veterans for Peace. There's another one in Albany. There's a VFW Thomas Paine chapter. He was the originator of the International Declaration of Human Rights. Basically, he did rights of man, which is adopted into our Constitution, which you don't seem enthusiastic about, as part of Article 6. So any one of those articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you don't find their own Constitution satisfactory, you can cite in filing criminal complaints. So my concern is, I guess, do you know the difference between capitalism and corporatism? I mean, the problem seems to be corporatism, which, as Thomas Paine pointed out in 1805, the idea of granting charters and monopolies is not in our Constitution. And the assuming to grant them unlawfully is criminal. So if corporations never had a right to begin, they have no right to continue, and we can invoke racketeering standards against them and other criminal charge and take all their stuff, like we do with drug kingpins.
Okay, so one question was around filing charges, the other one was around corporatism and capitalism. Can we take your question too, and then we'll just, a few minutes to speak to all of it?
A few minutes to speak to that? No, just kidding.
A few minutes of information. We have been at war with each other forever throughout history. How many people on this planet understand that anyone in an army is a slave, just obeying, following orders? This brain, for most people all over the planet, does not work very well, is not well educated at all. That's why we still go to war with each other. That's why we still have criminals who are politicians.
Not so close.
I'm going to
Bring it down here.
I'm going to give you about a dozen pages of information. And 2 of the headlines I think are very, very valuable. That's 1, and that's 2. We have to hold accountable. We have to start to imprison war criminals. And I would suggest maybe in the future a title, instead of, in addition to War Criminals Watch, a title, Imprison War Criminals. I know Obama is out of his mind. He has no idea about what the hell is going on. We have 444 Chernobyls, Fukushimas all over this planet. Our species doesn't know basically enough about what the hell it is doing to itself. What I'm saying now is really hold them accountable, start putting them in prison, and we've got to educate ourselves 5%, 20%, 50% more than we're educated right now. Does that make sense?
Thanks. So we have a couple of accountability and holding them accountable, imprisoning them, charging them. All of these questions of the war crimes, you know, and I will say this, the specificity here that World Can't Wait has been involved in is the war criminals of the Bush regime, those who did the torture, who came up with the legal justification, who carried out the so-called war on terror with the justification of 9/11 have been particularly targeted. And all of us, and especially David and I, spent a lot of time working for the impeachment of George Bush. I mean, my answer to that, to the question of, do I understand the Constitution? I do. Do I think it is a remedy in itself? Absolutely not. It's part of the political structure that keeps these injustices happening. How, all that said, the one factor, you know, the authority and the reason and the sanity that has not yet been mobilized and brought to bear is all of the people across the globe who do care about humanity and the planet being organized, motivated, and given a vehicle to hold those forces accountable. I think that that's really the particular question, that, and these folks have a lot to say about that.
We have less than 2 years now, by statute of limitations, at the most optimistic interpretation, to prosecute most of the Bush-Cheney gang for crimes of defrauding us into a war, crimes of warrantless spying, and the crimes of torture, except those cases where there's a dead body, where there is no statute of limitations. Most of these could be prosecuted. There could be a prosecution launched by a state attorney general or even a local prosecutor, if we could find a decent one anywhere in this country. So this has got to be at the top of our agenda. I want to applaud Veterans for Peace, of which I'm an associate non-veteran member, as one of the best, most principled and effective groups we have in this country. And some of us, including a couple of members of Veterans for Peace, had a protest yesterday at the South Korean consulate uptown because they had just gotten off a plane from South Korea, where they had just arrived on a plane from here, and they were not allowed in because they were going to join a nonviolent protest of the building of a naval base to destroy the island of Jeju Island, to build another base around China with money borrowed from China. It's absolute insanity. It's going to have been one of the most beautiful places in the world. Unless it's stopped. They are now building. I think it is important. I was on a panel this morning, and this panel with my brothers and sisters who have a slightly different long-term philosophy from my own, where apparently we have to choose between, Wall Street capitalism and the non-existence of government. I would take Scandinavian capitalism, I would take honest, regulated capitalism over what we've got in a heartbeat. There are shades and differences here. I would respectfully say no to Marxian or Thomas Painian revolution. I think we have developed in the past century skills of nonviolent resistance that have proven over twice as effective as violence on violence's own terms. And that if we don't take advantage of that because we have affection for certain historical figures, we're missing the boat. We watch the people of Egypt do more in 3 weeks than we can do in 3 decades because they smartly and wisely use better tools. And I would respectfully reject the notion that we have had war throughout history because we have bad brains. We have had our brains long before there was history. War is a relatively new phenomenon. It's no older than 12,000 years. It's quite sporadic. It's in some complex sedentary societies and not others. It comes and goes. It's limited. It's rejected. It's eliminated. We had a movement arise 100 years ago to get rid of it, and it got rid of it among the wealthy nations. The rich nations went to war in World War II because of a combination of a number of bizarre factors, including a particular lunatic in Germany, and have not done so since. But they go to war against the poor nations. And until we can eliminate that, we will still have war. But violence is leaving our culture. Violence over the past 4 or 5 centuries and with increasing speed has been leaving our culture. Physical abuse, abuse of spouses, abuse of children, abuse of animals, fist fights, blood feuds, dueling to settle individual disputes. It's all going away. And war is going away. And although we still have horrendous wars, we do not have them the way that we used to. The trend is positive. The counter trend is that in this particular country, we have empowered a single individual to make war with weaponry the likes of which is never seen before, and we've based our whole economy around it. And so we have a particular problem and a particular responsibility in this war economy, in this country where we've given a single individual the powers that even the writers of our Constitution who got so much wrong knew you could not give a single individual. And then they go on a book tour instead of going on trial. So we have to take that last step to get rid of the kinds of war that we still have. But to believe that it's in our genes or in our brains goes against all evidence. And war has transformed so dramatically. The types of war we have now are newer than the automobile, and nobody says that's in our genes. We can't get rid of it. It's a problem that's created by our culture, and we can choose to get rid of it, and we are the authorities to appeal to.
If you want to, I'll give you a final word. I'll just say a quick word.
Okay.
Yeah, because I know you got a lot in this pad here.
Well, I'm getting hit from all sides. No, it's good.
Okay.
I love it.
All right. Well, one more thing for your plate. Look, I'm not going to rip into
No. Good. No, it's great. I love it.
Like I applaud what David said 1,000%. Especially, we could look to other societies that actually exist right now to gain models of new ways to live. The Nordic countries, Iceland. Iceland, their banks went down, but what did they do? They charged the bankers. There actually was accountability in Iceland and to a different extent in the Nordic countries. Issues around women's rights. And Norway is one of the few countries to enact gender quotas, for businesses, things like that. There's actually a lot of positive things already out there, which I think if we maybe it's not going to answer everything, but there's tangible models that work, which we shouldn't just throw away in a serious way. And following David's point about, are we natural-born killers? No, I think we've evolved, and a number of books have come out recently around this, how, these are actually, despite what Fox News is drumming up, one of the more peaceful times in human existence. And so that's also something to keep in mind as we push forward to maybe leverage that and to create even more movements for peace. All right, and now the rebuttal.
No,
Okay.
Partial rebuttal. Well, first on the human nature question, I agree wholeheartedly with what David said. Blaming human nature exculpates the criminals that actually launched these wars. We did not decide to invade Iraq because of whatever. That was a decision made by a political structure and probably 20 people who represent the interests of a global capitalist empire. And, we can talk about the plasticity and potential of human beings, largely shaped by our environment, and therefore capable of in a different setting of being very different. But there's a structure of violence that exists, and it's that structure that launches these wars, and that structure is rooted in an economic system. Okay. On what you brought up, first of all, I mean, I do disagree with you theoretically and ideologically, but I'm still glad you guys are doing what you're doing. You know, I think it takes a lot of different kinds of opposition and resistance and different voices to have the kind of movement that everybody's been talking about, you know, to stop this monster. So I love the fact that I wish more people would take the initiative like you guys did and do something. Get out there and try to do something. You know, I applaud that. You know, I'll try to be brief here. I just have to say, so many deep issues are being raised here. This is really important to be getting into. We're not going to do them justice right now, but all these different things are precisely the kinds of arguments about the deep questions we ought to be having. Here's the problem I have with going back to Jeffersonian or Thomas Paine capitalism, is the nature of capitalism is the big fish eats the littler fish. That capital is a system driven by the anarchic competition between capitalists, and it leads to monopolies and giant centralization of capital, and you can see that arc over 200 years. And, you know, I'm not a corporate lawyer, but I'm sure there are many laws on the books that will legitimize this, and I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that no petition you send to the Supreme Court is going to change that. The whole economy is structured now so that it's dominated and controlled by 400 or 500 global financial and industrial groups. That's in the nature of capitalism. Regulation does not change that. In fact, why did Reagan do deregulation? Because it was in the interest of the profitability of capital. You know, so yes, I do, building on Karl Marx, think here just think about this. There's this very highly socialized network of production. We can do amazing things, technology, linking people in production all over the globe. The problem is it's owned by a handful of people and controlled for the interests of making profit and cutting somebody else's throat. So what we need is to socialize that socialized network of production, and you have to have a revolution to do that, and a new revolutionary state, and those resources have to be run in the interests of humanity and transforming the world. Okay, this is a longer discussion, but I wanted, and to you had said earlier, David, that, and just on the Sweden and Nordic country, go see the girl with a dragon tattoo and then come tell me about Nordic socialism. That's my snappy answer there. Your point I thought was interesting. Well, drinking, alcoholics may think, that alcohol benefits them. I'm not arguing that any of this benefits humanity. I'm saying this is how the imperialist system functions. In other words, think about it. They put a full court press on the Soviet Union in the 80s. They threatened nuclear war. They drew the Soviets into Afghanistan. They drove the price of oil down. The U.S. helped violently collapse the Soviet Union. Out of that collapse, the U.S. imperialists greatly benefited from that. You know, that's why you have 500 billionaires, or however many the number is now. So there's a tiny handful of people that are benefiting from it. There is a logic to what they do. It's an insane logic from our point of view, from humanity's point of view, but we have to see that there is actually that logic there. And then a couple of other things. I'm not going to agree that violence is subsiding. I know there's this new book out and so on. I mean, maybe the desire to end violence is growing. But think about this. Nuclear weapons and an environmental catastrophe that's growing. I mean, you're talking billions of people, you know. So I don't...
Entire human species, it's possible.
It is possible. It is possible, you know. The other thing, just in terms of the Egypt, look, I'll stop. I do feel it's very important to examine the first wave of socialist revolutions. Amazing things were done. For example, in China, after the revolution of 1949, they doubled lifespan from 35 to 62. They eliminated opium addiction, and not by shooting a bunch of people. They didn't invade other countries. So millions of lives were saved by that. That's worth studying. And in terms of the Egypt thing, I think that Egypt shows you actually need a revolutionary leadership and a revolution, because they're faced with the same system. It was very courageous what they did. I don't disagree, and I'm not arguing for any specific tactic at any particular moment in a struggle. So but they needed to go further and be better and have, revolutionary communist leadership, in my view, to have a real revolution, because now they're stuck with the same army, you know. So, but anyway, all these things are more, you have things to say back, I have things to say back, but it's a good argument to be having, I think, you know.
I want to thank everyone for coming and to
Oh,
say that
oops.
everyone's books are available here, and
Yeah.
also at the exhibit area of World Can't Wait and Revolution Books, I think, has some of.
Yeah, and the
stuff you've
basics
got.
I'd encourage people to look at. Quotes that just has a radically different way to look at the world.
Here are copies of the
Yeah.
Iran statement
So-
that Larry and there's some over there.
That was a lot of fun.
Thank you.